All right, Greg Schmaus, welcome to the show, man.
I'm excited to be back here. Thank you for having me again.
Yeah, dude. So, as we literally just talked about 10 seconds ago, the jumping off question I want to ask you, and because we never actually got into this, but it's pretty much the story of your life. And I know last time we didn't end up jumping on it. And
Mm,
specifically, things I'm very curious about. For anyone that doesn't know, is you had a history dealing with OCD, and
mm,
you dealt with that. And also, but for the purposes of this story, I'd actually like us to start at the beginning as much as possible. So, like, like
mm,
little kid Greg, I find that the most fascinating thing is seeing that journey from childhood and seeing what is the same and what is different than who we turn into. And just, yeah,
mhm,
take us on that whole journey, brother. I'd love to hear it.
mm. It's funny when you asked me that question, which prior to recording, you saw the reaction of telling your story. And, little Greg that you just talked about was very much the invisible child who was afraid of being seen, who never
Mm,
felt heard, never kind of had a voice. I was very, very quiet. I didn't really speak all that much. And so for me, sharing my story is actually me feeling seen and feeling heard with which actually feels very vulnerable for
mm.
that like younger part of me. So anytime I go on a podcast and the first question is like, tell us your story, it's way harder for me to actually go into that than asking me a question of like, holistic health or spirituality. Like
Mm.
that stuff's easy for me because it's not personal.
Yeah,
So like
exactly.
the personal question is like, oh, that invisible child's going to be seen. So yeah, I was very quiet, and I always used my body initially as my way of expressing myself, which is why I got into sports. I was very athletic. I was kind of always that kid that whatever sport he played, he was like the best athlete. But
Really?
outside, yeah, but
Wow.
outside of that, I was like socially awkward. I didn't really talk much. I was like, that was my way of like feeling validated.
Mm.
And, I played soccer, I was ski racer, but then I got into golf, and golf was really like my big passion that I ended up leaving home at 16 and I moved down to South Carolina. I went to a golf and tennis academy, and my whole dream was to play on the PGA Tour. That's what like I was always kind of like working towards. And I ended up getting a scholarship to play Division I golf in Texas at the University of Houston.
Wow.
And that's where my journey really changed. That's where there was a big turning point where I
How
experienced,
old were you?
I was 18
Gotcha.
at the time, yeah. Um, where I experienced a physical trauma. I had to have surgery, went under anesthesia. And as I was kind of like coming out of that and recovering, that's when I started to experience a lot of like OCD, a lot of like chronic
Oh.
anxiety, like panic attacks, insomnia. Like that's when my whole like healing journey started, was
Wow.
back in college. And, I tried all like the conventional approaches and nothing really helped. And that's where eventually I kind of got into more of the holistic health world and kind of Paul Chek's teachings. And that's where after a couple of years, he became, my coach and mentor, and did many years of healing work. And that's kind of really what kind of redirected me away from my athletic pursuits and kind of into the work that I'm doing now.
Hmm. Wow. That's interesting that you say that yeah, you had this, if I recall correctly, a surgery that brought
Uh-huh.
on OCD and insomnia. Because I think, including myself, I think a lot of people discount the physical how the physical impacts the emotional. I think a lot of the time we put them in two boxes. Like if you have a physical injury, it's a physical problem and it has a
Mhm.
physical impact on your body, and that's it. And then like what you just said is like you had this surgery, like a physical surgery, and then you ended up getting OCD and insomnia, and did you say depression?
There was some depression, but it was mostly like chronic anxiety, and
Anxiety.
OCD was the big one. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just like I'm just like, wow. And then, you get into the gut microbiome. And then, like, the new literature is all about the gut impacting the mind and the emotional state. And, like, dude, like, I study Ben Greenfield, I study Paul CHEK, I study all of these people. I know all of this stuff. You know what I mean? But a lot of the time, it still doesn't land for me. Like, I know it cognitively, but, I can't feel how my gut impacts my mind. I feel Anton Czachor has it's almost like I'm a static entity, where it's like Anton has a certain level of mental health. He's sensitive, he's emotional. These are the boxes I kind of put myself in. Like, I'm sensitive, I'm emotional, and I usually go through, bouts of anxiety or depression when there's a stimulus. Is usually not necessarily out of the blue. Is usually like my environment is emotionally toxic, physically toxic, but mostly emotionally, or work is stressful. So it's usually like, for me, I can always find a physical a physical reason for any emotional change. Usually it's not starting on the emotional level. And so from your perspective, from everything you've learned about that mind body connection, what do you actually think instigated, the OCD, the anxiety, the insomnia from that occurrence?
Well, I could explain it or theorize in many different ways, but what I actually think is, I went under anesthesia, and anesthesia takes you kind of like as close to like death
Oh,
as you can go without actually going there,
wow.
because it's taking you into such a deep state of unconsciousness. And your whole, autonomic system, everything is slowing down to such a degree that it's really taking you out of the world that you knew. And it's almost like anytime you go under anesthesia, it's very much like a death and rebirth process. So I think that the surgery and the anesthesia, the going into it and then awaking out of it, was a huge transition point in my journey. And, something my girlfriend once said, which always stuck with me, is it's amazing what the body will take on for the evolution of the soul. And I think my soul's path in this lifetime was to be a healer and to be a teacher. It wasn't to be an athlete. And that surgery, that death and rebirth process, was a redirecting of my path onto what is more in alignment with what I came here to do. And the anxiety, the OCD, all of that stuff was kind of like my initiation as, let's say, a wounded healer. Of like, I have to go through my own firewalk first before I can support anyone else with theirs. Because if I don't go through my own, then I'm just like approaching it from like intellectual knowledge, not authentic experience.
Yeah.
So I think more on like I guess you could say, esoteric level.
Yeah.
That's really what was happening inside of me. But also, there were little details that showed up. Like, for example, the first night when I was recovering from my surgery, I went to sleep and I woke up in the middle of the night and I thought I saw like a person in the doorway, which, sometimes when you're waking out of like your dream state, sometimes there's projections of your psyche, or
Totally.
some people believe you might be like seeing into other dimensions of reality or whatever it
Yeah.
might be. I don't know, whatever it is, but I kind of like saw this being in the doorway. It was like this woman. I was just like, kind of looked a little scary and dark. And I'm like, I've never experienced this before. So it kind of like created a stress response inside of me. And at the time, I was still very much like physically compromised. I was very vulnerable. I couldn't get up. Like, I wasn't able to walk around. And so after that, for a couple of months, anytime I was like indoors, I would always be like checking doors to make sure there was no one there. And it kind of created like this almost like obsessive compulsive like looping pattern of always needing to like check any door to make sure there was like no one there. And that's when like the pattern in my mind started kind of like constantly looping on things, constantly repeating things and looping back and forth. And, people might call it like intrusive thoughts and things like that. So I experienced all of that kind of like internal chaos. And so there were like little details of that experience that did act as a little bit more of a trigger. But I do think that I called that in for a reason, so you can obviously look at it from different vantage points.
Yeah, so I just want to say right now, my audience is super woo-woo and open-minded. So for the remainder of this conversation, bro, if you want to go into like the esoteric, man, like I literally for the last like I've been developing my psychic abilities for the last, in a big way, 2 months. And I've been like kind of talking about that very openly. So they're very open to all of this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Like, believe me, like they won't think you're any crazier than me.
Sure.
You know what I mean? But like when you're saying that, God, there's a lot of fascinating things. Like the person in the door is interesting too, because like I've had paranormal experiences myself.
Yeah.
That's an interesting one. I've had channeling experiences. Paranormal, and like I don't know if you experience this, but when it happens, like you're so sure it's real, like it's so real to you, like and it makes sense. And then as time goes on and you get pulled back into the physical 3D world, and you start working, you start watching TV, you talk to people with very kind of closed-minded perspectives on things. Like for me, like as much as, again, because luckily I recorded the experience for me, so I can like go into it again and just be reminded of the physical wild nature of it. Like it was just, it was so intense, and the intensity is what is kind of like my trigger back to like, oh yeah, this was real. Plus like I'm best friends with psychics and stuff. So like I've talked to psychics about it. And they'll give me more information. Like they can literally tap into my energy and be like, yep, like, I spent New Year's with a psychic, one of my mom's best friends. And, I'm moving to Mexico, next week actually. So it's like a big change is happening. And she told me like all about this phase of my journey. She's like, for the next, I forget if she said a year or two, but she said like for the next year or two, your whole life is like the universe is teaching you how to let go of your mind. You know what I mean? To trust the process and not always have a plan, a structure. Because this is my default way of being, is highly organized. It's just ridiculously organized. I go with the flow is terrifying for me because I'm like, I can't control it. It's scary. And so like, and the reason why I mention all of this is like, I know with me sometimes, like I can have such a powerful experience. Then after like 6 months or something, like at least I can start to like almost doubt that it happened. You can start to look at it like, oh, like was it like, because your memory becomes foggier, and because your memory becomes foggier, and then like like if you ever tell someone about it who's not open to that kind of thing, they give you their perspective on it, and then that in some sense, interestingly, I almost look at conversations like I don't mean it in a bad way, but like thought parasites, where like literally like you're taking on somebody's embedded idea, like energy is just like it's embedding itself in your consciousness. And so now your consciousness isn't just the fertile ground of yourself. It has other people's plants planted in your fertile soil of your mind, right? You've planted your thoughts, your ideas, your experiences, and your memories are part of that fertile soil too. And in some sense, they put their ideas, and then, someone challenges you on something, it can be very interesting because then you have someone almost implanting a memory in your soil too. And then it's like, I think we've all been in that experience where, like, this has happened to me, and I know it's happened to other people around me, where you'll talk about a memory and then you're sure that it was your memory, but someone realizes like, oh, I told you that. And you're like, what? You're the reason why little bit of this memory's filled in with that information. That was actually you. That wasn't me. And they're like, yeah, I told you that like 2 years ago. But, and then you just realize that in some sense, like, potentially, I don't know the extent of this, but like potentially like our memories are this collaborative process of our base memory, and then all of the times we've told the story and how other people have interpreted the story, how other people have taught, like, kind of mimicked back to you your story in their words. And for some reason, sometimes your brain will almost override part of your memory with their word and their interpretation of your memory. And it just becomes really wild. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think this is also why one of the, I've been working through this a little bit in my own life recently, which relates to some of kind of the patterns of codependency, which is not trusting yourself. And one of the big things that trauma does is it disconnects you from your instinctual nature, because the nervous system says, if I trusted myself and it resulted in this trauma, I can't trust myself anymore because I must have gotten myself into this situation. So, you know, one of the first things that happens with trauma is we disconnect from our intuition, our instincts, our ability to trust ourselves. And, you know, that's where many of us end up reaching outside of us for guidance more and more and more, whether it's from external information, the news, social media, even teachers and coaches and mentors. Even I've found myself using like psychics.
Me
like
too, man. Me too,
Yeah.
bro. Keep
like
going.
I can trust this psychic more than I trust myself.
Yeah.
That's all a trauma response. And it's also a response from patterns of codependency of people telling you that your experience is not correct.
Yeah.
You know? So we start doubting ourselves. And there's a difference between questioning yourself and doubting yourself. You know, questioning yourself is very healthy, like questioning your experience, questioning your belief system. That's more from a place of curiosity. But that's not self-doubt. You know, self-doubt is more from a place of low self-esteem than actually being able to question your belief systems. That takes self-esteem. It takes self-worth to be able to question your belief systems or your biases, which is why low self-esteem is what actually creates defensiveness. Defensiveness is the unwillingness to question your own biases, your own dogmas, your own belief systems. So that connection to the ability to trust yourself, that's, you know, something that I'm working on in my own life this year, is not looking outside of me as much for guidance as I used to. You know, I'm actually even taking like a full year's fast from like external information.
Wow.
And like really just developing my own inner resources. And it's really returning back to my ability to trust myself. And you know, one of my teachers that I've studied a lot of her work is Caroline Myss. She's, you know, one of the leading experts in the kind of world of archetypes. And one thing she says is like, she's also like a medical intuitive, like super tapped in. And she says, look, everyone is psychic. Everyone is psychic. Everyone has psychic abilities, but not everyone has the self-esteem to be able to access them.
Oh.
And really it's accessing your intuition and your psychic abilities. Number one is based on your ability to trust yourself and not doubt what's coming through you. And number two, it's, are you ready for that amount of truth that quickly? Right? A lot of people really shut their intuition out because they're not really ready for the truth, you know, because the truth is inconvenient.
Yeah.
You know, the truth might be of like, hey man, you need to move to Mexico. Meanwhile, you just like, you have a house here, you have, you know, you have a whole life built up in like this one location. And, you know, spirit says, yeah, you need to move to Mexico. Well, a lot of people don't want the inconvenience of that guidance. So they'll block that psychic or intuitive part of them out. So I think it's very interesting of like the ability to trust yourself and the ability to surrender to truth, no matter how inconvenient it seems at the time, is really kind of like how we break through and kind of be able to access those deeper levels of guidance more regularly. And trust me, I'm not there. I'm still working on it.
Bro,
But I'm definitely like aware of, you know, where I've, you know, intentionally blocked myself out, not trusted myself, things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, everything you just said there, like that hit. Yeah, me and you seem to be on a very very similar journey this year. Because yeah, like yeah, it's really interesting. Like I've also like I know because I'm tapping into a lot of psychic abilities right now.
Hmm.
And it kind of blows me away because I'm like, where were these my entire life? Where were these when I was
Hmm.
five? But then again, I went through a lot of trauma when I was a kid. And so when you
Hmm.
said trauma has you detached from your intuition, yourself, and it externalizes your decision making process and your trust process, like, my God, that's true, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had no access to my own source of truth growing up. Like, zero. None. And I still find myself, yeah, going to psychics. That's my biggest crutch. I go to psychics
Mm-hmm.
a lot. Like again, new like so what happened was, so I'm asking my soul because like I followed what Paul Chek teaches about talking to your soul, so I do that every morning. And so because I fundamentally don't trust myself, I need to trust a process because in
Hmm.
some sense the process is external from you. So my process is I need to know where I'm going to be living in 3 months. When I finish my vacation, I need to know where I'm going to be living because I have podcasts scheduled starting March 1st. Okay, so I need to know what time zone I'm in. I need to know where I'm going to be. I need to know if I'm going to have internet. And this is fundamentally all me not trusting myself because if I trust in myself, I can just talk to my soul every day. What do I need to do today? Where do I need to be today? And trust that I will end up where I need to be and doing what I need to do, and that I'll have internet if I need to have internet that day. But again, I wanted to know, okay, this week where I'm going to be, Puerto Vallarta. Okay, next week Cancun. Like I want to know week by week where I'm going to be, what I'm going to be doing. And what happened is every morning I would talk to my soul, and my soul won't give me any fucking information outside of 1 week when I land. So I have a month and a half trip, and I might be in Mexico for 6 months. I don't know. Could be the end of my life. Like I could be end up making that my home base. I don't know. But I know I'm starting in Morelia. It won't give me any information after that, and so bro, I spent like half of New Year's with a psychic. Like, well, can I know this? Am I bringing my recording equipment? Should I like schedule things in Pacific time? Like all of these things. And Diane would repeatedly just go, Anton, this whole process about you learning to trust yourself. Like, you can't go to me for this. I get it. I get it. But like, can I bring my recording equipment? I would just like, I'd get an answer. I'd be like, yeah, I get that. I get that. And then I'd just like, it was my anxiety. It was like, I don't want to be homeless. My
Yeah.
number one fear is my two fears. I don't want to be homeless and I don't want to let everyone down because I have a fear that if I don't give people consistent content, they will realize that I'm not consistent, I'm not trustworthy, and they'll all leave and they will no longer support me or be part of my community. So again, abandonment issues. That's abandonment 101 because I was abandoned in high school. A feeling of abandonment from my father because abusive household, that kind of thing, right? So it's like there's this feeling of just abandonment at every level. Then I lost my best friend in my second year of university because I fucked it up. Like I was fundamentally the one that screwed up that relationship, but it was my best friend. Like we did everything together. It was also totally a codependent relationship, but it's still like I lost my second half, right? So again, growing up, dad, abusive, never felt like I could trust dad. Have my best friends in high school. They all leave me in the first week of grade 9. Again, I know it was fundamentally my fault. I was a bit judgmental. A lot of them were getting into cannabis and weed, and I was straight edge. And so without really saying much, I would judge them for it. And I know that pushed them away. And then when it came to my roommate Ryan in my second year, I took for granted all of the things he helped around the house with, right? I was kind of a bit of a slob. I didn't really take care of myself very much. And so when I look back, those fundamental relationships, my father, I'm not sure, I probably played some sort in that when I was really young, just energetically, karmically, meant to create something. But high school and university were both my fault fundamentally. Like when I look back, I'm like, yeah, I was it was a really weird thing where I thought they left me, but really I pushed them away. I created this circumstance that would force them to be like, fuck this guy, essentially, right? And so I had these like core abandonment challenges. And so that is my number one fear with my community, is they'll abandon me as soon as times get tough. Because that's it. As soon as times get tough, people abandon me. That's my story. And in some sense, it's like beyond a story. Like, as you probably know, like trauma has like a physical embedding. There's a physical aspect to it as well. The story is what we crystallize it into being with our story in some sense. We immortalize it. The story immortalizes it. It doesn't allow the trauma to release out of our system. At least from my perspective, right now. So it's like those two things. So it's like I fundamentally don't trust myself. Because if I and also I've been really frustrated learning how to talk to my soul, because there's been a lot of times where, again, I will feel like I'm being withheld an answer. And my understanding is, again, I don't trust the universe. So, or at least this is so like the nature of the way I'm acting and feeling would signify that I don't trust the universe. Because I'm like, I need the answer now. I need the answer to this question. I can't move forward in my life without this answer. And the universe is withholding it, and I feel like I'm doing something wrong. Like, what the hell am I doing wrong? Is my ego getting in the way? Am I unable to read the energy fluctuations in my body? And so it's highly stressful, especially when I'm planning this move to Mexico and my whole life is being upended, right? So it's this interesting thing where, and then this is really interesting too, man. So I had a support system in some sense. So I have somebody who lives in Mexico who invited me to stay with her for 3 weeks, right? She also said, reach out to my son. He'd love to talk to you and come on your podcast. Here's his Instagram. Here's his email. So these people literally invited me to like stay with them, right? Mm-hmm. The moment I figure out I'm moving to Mexico, this was like a month ago, I send both of them a message, ghosted. I still haven't received an email back, a message back. And I'm just like, what the fuck? And then my friend, another friend, I'm not going to say the name just in case, because I don't want to create any bad blood or whatever. But he's one of my closest friends, and it's not even a bad thing, but we've been kind of, there's been a feeling like a rift created between us, just because lives are busy. My life is busy, his life is busy, right? And I know that, but it's like, again, when I just objectively look at my life right now, I'm essentially watching as I commit to a new life. The number one theme of this new chapter of my life is learn to trust the universe and fundamentally learn to trust yourself, because you are part of the universe. Don't rely on organization. Don't rely on logic. Don't rely on comfort and support systems. And so don't rely on organization. So when I'm asking my soul to know the end result of this trip and of this experience, it won't give me it. It'll only give me the first step on the journey. Then all of the people that I could rely on, because this person is literally going to let me stay with her. She invited me to stay with her for 3 weeks in Mexico. That's comfort. I know where I'm going to be at this week, right? For 3 weeks. I know where I'm going to be. Again, that's a crutch. And then if I was to reach out to her son, I'd be able to collect the information there through her son. So both of them, like, we're getting super woo-woo here, man. But I literally feel like the universe has put like almost like is disconnected the cell phones between us. It's like I'm guessing she's gonna come back to me after I needed her. So essentially, once it's past the time in our stay where I was going to stay with her, then she's probably going to be like, oh, hey, Anton, for whatever reason, I missed this email. I didn't get this. Like, bro, I'm pretty sure that's going to happen. And then her son's probably going to fucking message me like within a day of that and be like, hey, bro, dude, thanks for reaching out. I for whatever reason, I didn't see this. And then like, I just have this feeling like this whole process is about like shattering all of my support systems. And then the psychics I'd usually go to, I'm getting like a message like, don't reach out to your psychic friends. And then when I did ask Diane, pretty much it was always, you can't know that yet. You can't know that yet. You're not supposed to know that yet. So it's just like, it's this wild thing where I think I'm rewriting that trauma from my past, that fundamental trauma of like, essentially, yeah, because my relationship growing up was with a parent who said, "You're not entitled to your experience. This is what you should believe about it. This is what happened. You're not entitled to living your life the way you want. You are going to be working a corporate job. You are going to do this. You're going to do that." So it was very like kind of helicopter parenting in some degree, right? So I feel like for whatever reason, as you said, like just the universe is like stepping in and holding things back from me. And it'll be really interesting again. I love the esoteric stuff because I love talking to people who are a fundamental part of your journey and ask them what was going on through your head when you weren't responding to me, or what was going on in your life when you didn't have the opportunity to respond to me when my ego thought I needed you. Because it's not my higher self thought I needed you, my ego thought I needed you. So it's interesting to see, like, because from my perspective and from everything I've learned in my life, the universe sets up synchronicities when you're ready for them and when you need to have them, right? And so, for example, like I'm sure me and you have been synchronistically attracted to each other because, again, like I don't know what's going to happen with you and Katerina. I don't know if you guys are going to work together. Maybe you're not. Who knows? There's no expectations. But just the simple fact that like she saw the podcast that we did and she loved it and she loved you and she's like, "Hey, can you reach out to Greg for me?" Like right there, like that was some level of a bridge, right? And so I'm always curious to talk to people who are setting something up for me in my life or setting something up for them. What was going through my head and what was the synchronicity catalyst in my consciousness when I was helping somebody with something that was fundamental to their life path? And then vice versa, when I talked to my friend Joseph, and when I look back, he was the catalyst for my entire life opening up. It'd be interesting to talk to Joseph. "Hey man, remember when you did that one thing that opened up my entire life? What was going through your head? Like, what was this random stimulus response catalyst that made you want to reach out to me, made you want to say something specific to me?" You know what I mean? And so like when you're talking about, yeah, like you're over relying on psychics, over relying on external things to give you a false sense of security, like your life's not going to fall apart because you fundamentally, I'm speaking to myself, that I fundamentally don't trust in my ability to survive without these external things supporting me. It's like I always need the world to support me. So there's not really too much of a question in that. But like I was just, yeah, everything you said, man, it just like it hit. And I was like, fuck, both of us are on the same journey this year of learning to trust ourselves,
Yeah. A couple things that was coming up for me was, number one, we can start a recovery program called Psychics Anonymous.
Yeah.
Which I think would be great. The second is I remember Paul recommending a book to me called The Fourfold Way, Fourfold Way, I think. And it was by this shaman, and she was like an anthropologist, Angeles Arian.
Yeah.
And she writes about the four core addictions that humanity struggles with. And the four addictions are intensity, perfectionism, needing to know, and the fixation on what's wrong or what's not working. So that, I've struggled with all four of those, but that needing to know is actually one of the biggest addictions that, we all struggle with. And I think the less and less we trust life over time as a result of trauma, the more and more we need to know and get hooked on that addiction. And all addictions are an attempt at seeking a sense of safety and a sense of security. And I think that's, a very subtle addiction that many of us have. And, in terms of the abandonment, it's, a big thing I've experienced in my own life, which, I think life or the universe or whatever words you want to use will always mirror back to us in our relationships with other people an aspect of our relationship with ourself. So, whether it's someone abandoned us as a child and we haven't healed that wound, and something that, happens after a wound like that is we start abandoning ourselves. We continuously abandon ourselves as a way of trying to not be abandoned by others again. Like for me, it's been like, instead of being myself, it's who does this person want me to be?
Bro, I'm
Right.
with you there, man.
So that's me abandoning myself out of the fear of, if I'm my authentic self, what if they abandon me? So let me try and figure out who they want me to be. I'll kind of shapeshift into that. And there's a less of a chance that they'll abandon me. But I think a lot of times when we're being ghosted, or people are not answering us, or we're feeling like there's another abandonment, it's because we haven't healed that wound in ourselves of the ways in which we're continuously abandoning ourselves. And it could be in subtle things. It could be like, the people pleaser in us that says yes to something that we want to say no to, or, any number of just even like day-to-day stuff that shows up. And, that's another thing that I've set an intention for in this new year, is to really be crystal clear what's a yes and what's a no, and make sure that when I say yes to another person, I'm not saying no to myself, because that is a form of abandonment. Because there's the wound of abandonment is in there. Anytime we say no, anytime we say yes to someone, but we really wanted to say no, a lot of times we're saying yes because we're afraid that if I say no to them, they might abandon us if we need them in the future.
Yeah.
So it's always a mirror. Relationships are always mirroring back to us parts of ourselves. So I know there wasn't a question in there, but
it's okay, man. Bro, we're just sharing, man. Wow.
which is all very codependent.
What is codependent?
Well, I don't think codependence, I think we demonize codependency, which
True.
codependency started when you were in the womb. When you were in the womb and when you were a baby and a child, you were totally dependent on mom, on dad, on whoever your caretakers were. So the pattern of codependency, first of all, is a very natural stage of development. It's a natural stage of creating attachments with parent-child, for example. And eventually, obviously, we want to move through those stages into more of a sense of independency and then interdependency. But, where we get stuck is, as a child, when we're in the child archetype, we're completely powerless. We're kind of helpless. Like, we're dependent on someone else for our own survival. So mom, dad, or whoever is our lifeline. So what the child says is, the child says, who do I have to be to get my needs met with this person? Because the child doesn't have an internal sense of self yet. The child's sense of self is very externalized. It's based on the feedback it gets from others.
And theta brainwaves.
Yeah, so the child in that theta state is very open and says, and has a hard time differentiating self from other. So it sees mom as happy, and the child thinks mom is happy with me. Then mom is upset, and the child says mom is upset with me. So the child develops its sense of self based on mom or dad's experience of itself. So the child then says, okay, who do I have to be and what do I have to do to get my needs met? To make sure I still have food on the table, a roof over my head, and a bed to sleep in. Right? So that's where, especially if you're an empathic, energetically sensitive being, your sense of self is still enmeshed in other people's experience of you.
Yeah.
And that's one of the biggest patterns that I'm working on healing in myself, even to this day, is where I still derive a sense of self based in someone else's experience of me. And if I'm still enmeshed with that, it leads to constant people pleasing, approval seeking, and self sabotage. So, one thing I've been exploring is, can I be true to myself, which might result in someone else being disappointed in me or someone else being upset with me or triggered by me? And can I still feel really good about myself? Can I be in the experience of someone else being disappointed in me and me not translate that into I'm now disappointed in myself?
Yeah.
And that's the only way that you can actually hold space for someone, is if you no longer derive your sense of self from their experience of you, because you can't hold space for someone else's disappointment if you still see your sense of self in that. This is why, like Matt Kahn says, in order to truly hold space for another person, you have to take yourself out of their narrative. Because if you're still enmeshed with their narrative, if your sense of self is still enmeshed with their narrative and their story, then you can't actually hold space for them, because you have to defend a part of yourself.
Yeah.
Right? You have to close a part of you off from any sort of like compassion or inquiry.
Yeah.
Right?
It makes me think of friendships. Like, are friendships actually like the most socially acceptable form of codependency that we all get brought in without knowing? And something I want to jump back to is when we said we're just sharing, and then you said something like that's codependency, or what did you mean by that?
Can you say that again?
So I shared my Mexico thing, and then you shared something, and then you was like, there's not really a question in this. And I said, that's okay, we're just sharing. And then you made a comment after, there was a pause, and then you said something along the lines of, and that's codependency, and this is what brought us right into this. But what I'm curious if you saw something that was codependent in sharing.
Oh, no. No, there
No.
was just some element of what we were talking about in terms of like the unhealed trauma and the deriving your sense of self based in someone else's experience of us. That was kind of like the starting point of the codependency.
Oh, I thought you said that we were locked in a codependent relationship in this podcast as
Oh,
we were
no.
sharing. Because
No.
I was like, bro, did he just see like the fucking 4D chessboard? And he's like, actually, we're being codependent right now.
No.
And this is actually a question.
Maybe.
Like, well, the reason why I brought up the friendship thing was I was like, it seems like one of the fundamental things we all get caught up in codependently is friendships. Because we're all invested in how our friends think of us in some sense. That's why we're friends. We rely on each other and we want to show up with each other. We want to be loved by each other and we want to love each other. It's like almost like with a friend, we're recreating a relationship with like our mother or our father, whoever we had like a good relationship with. Because I think like for me, it was a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kind of thing, where it was like, dad was difficult, mom was martyr, savior, friend. And so essentially to survive that household, me and my mom got really close. Very, very close. And then now most of my friendships mimic my relationship with my mom growing up in some sense, where we're very almost symbiotic, where we help each other deeply, where, if something's going on, we will share really deep stuff and hold space for each other. And then when you talked about holding space, you need to be outside of their narrative. Maybe I never hold space because in some sense I'm always invested in the narrative of my friends. Yeah, what's your perspective on friendships in the possibility of a codependent lens?
Well, I think there's like a spectrum, and I don't think it's healthy to go to the extreme of just not giving a shit at all, like what anyone thinks of you, and you're just like, you can like become, sociopathic and narcissistic, and
Yeah.
I don't think that's like, to have no awareness of like someone else's experience of you also
Yeah.
means like you don't know how to tailor yourself at all in a form of mindfulness to how someone might receive something that you have to say. So if we don't have any aspect of that attachment or I don't want to say codependency, but sensitivity, then there's a lack of empathy, right? So I think that results in, like take someone with autism. Someone with autism really doesn't have much access to empathy.
Really?
Right? When I say that, I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean like they don't really have access to like social cues or how someone might be receiving what you have to say. So there's a lot of the dynamics of relationship that an autistic person might struggle with. My girlfriend's daughter has special needs. She's not autistic, but I've been around a lot of her special needs friends who have autism. And a lot of times they'll say something that you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe she just said that. So there's a lack of like an awareness of how something might be received by the other. Right. So that's the one end of the spectrum. But the other end of the spectrum is where your sense of self is so enmeshed in someone else's experience of you that you disempower yourself, or you abandon yourself, or you don't speak your truth because maybe you're so afraid that it might trigger, disappoint, or upset somebody that you compromise yourself over and over again. That would be the other extreme. So I think there's a nice middle ground. And I think that's probably where we're aiming for in relationship. But, especially an intimate relationship, that's where all of this stuff comes up to the surface. And it's where we might, take things, the most personally or things like that. And, I remember recently in my intimate relationship, my partner was, sharing something that I said or did in the past that really triggered a lot of her pain and a lot of her wounds. And those were like old pains and old wounds that were there well before the introduction of me into her life.
Yeah.
So, in the past, I would have gotten very like defensive that like, I didn't cause that pain, or I didn't like, so it could have created guilt. It could have created shame. It could have created defensiveness inside of me. But it was one of the first moments of my life where I was listening to her sharing, and she was kind of basically sharing with me how something I said or did created pain inside of her. And obviously our initial ego reaction is either guilt, shame, or defensiveness. But I was able to see how that pain was a part of her journey well before the introduction of me. And something I said or did may have brought that up inside of her, but I wasn't necessarily the cause of it. So as soon as I took myself out of her narrative, I was able to actually hold space for her, even though she was kind of calling me out on something, right? I was able to actually have true empathy and hold space and not go into guilt, shame, or defensiveness because I took myself out of the narrative, knowing that this is more an aspect of her journey and her own healing process than anything I may have done wrong. And that's one of the big things. And I think the healing of codependency, which I'm far from having healed it, it's something that I'm still kind of making the firewalk doing in the middle of, which is just because someone is experiencing pain, disappointment, is upset, or unmet expectations, it doesn't mean you did anything wrong. You know, as a child, we're conditioned to believe that if I say or do something and someone else is either disappointed, triggered, or upset with us, it must mean that what I said or did is wrong in some way.
Yeah, because they're gods.
Right? So that's one of the biggest patterns that we have to break within ourselves, is that conclusion that we draw, or that internal narrative that we create.
Yeah.
Which I do all the time.
Me too, man. Wow. Yeah, I was also thinking codependency and symbiotic relationships happen with different kinds of people in my life. Because I was gonna say, like, I just had a podcast with somebody else on Monday. Strong personality, alpha, like very, very alpha, very, like, you know, my way or the highway. Good guy, you know, high integrity, really good guy, but just like strong energy, right? And what was interesting about that one is I was very, like, it's opposite, I think, to most people. Where with that one, I could easily maintain my center. I could easily maintain an emotional distance. I could hold space for him, even if he was kind of calling me out or saying this. It's probably because that's not the kind of person I would mesh with. Where, like, for example, I was thinking when you were talking, I was like, you would be someone where I would be the most codependent with, because you feel very safe to me. And I feel like there would be almost like, I don't know if you remind me of my mom. I don't know. Like, there's a safety to your energy, and I can almost feel this energy, like almost like a Disney movie, like the Wicked Witch who he's like, oh, I love you, like, come over here, and then like they bake you in their oven. I almost feel like, I'm not saying you would ever do that, but I almost feel like your energy is like, it's something that like symbiotically with me, like calls me for, it's like, hey, you know, share, you know, it's okay. And it's like, I can almost feel this like soft invitation to share more and to get to almost attach our lives together. Our, like, you know, almost like this like bonding mechanism is forming. And I was like, I could definitely see if I was totally unconscious, you know, again, like a friendship forming with you that would be more symbiotic or codependent than, like, I would in some weird way care more about your opinion of me than the strong alpha guy. Like, in some weird ways, like, that I don't really care about. Like, I'm like, okay, you know, yeah, I don't care about that perception, but someone as open and soft or vulnerable as you, maybe it's literally because, like, again, it's like what you just said about intimacy, is like, why do our partners hurt us so easily? It's because, like, we feel safe enough to open our hearts up and take the walls down. And I think what I'm actually feeling is like, you know, you have a very calm center where, like, just in this conversation with you, like, I can almost feel like my walls going down a bit, my heart opening up and being more vulnerable with you than I would with other guests on my podcast, or at least the manner in which I share is slightly different with you. Sometimes I can be vulnerable with other guests, but if the guest is very alpha and strong, I will share vulnerably, but with an element of power as a way of protecting myself truly. I will say the thing that I'm vulnerable of, but not actually be vulnerable energetically in the moment. I'm stating it with power. Where with you, it's like there's a safety field where I'm like more vulnerable, and I'm like, yeah, I could see people, like, not just you, but anybody that has like kind of our archetypal enmeshment. I could feel like that is like, yeah, it's like the brotherhood element of an intimate relationship, where like you usually would have that with a sexual partner, but sometimes you can have that just with like a brotherhood, someone who you feel kind of comfortable with. You know what I mean? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I appreciate you sharing that. One of the reasons that is very often the case, you know, I love Ram Dass's work.
Yeah, me too.
You know, so, you know, Ram Dass's like classic teaching is becoming nobody. Right? He's got the documentary, the book, like Becoming Nobody. And if you really understand what that means, becoming nobody is really the ability to empty yourself, right? Like Ram Dass used to talk about his guru Maharaji, how there was this being there, but it was almost like there was no one in there.
Yeah.
Right? And when you empty yourself, you essentially become this container that holds space for someone else to come into you. Right? So for me, like, for example, I spend a lot of time in meditation emptying myself. And the more I empty myself, the more space there is inside of me to bring another in. So if you have like this alpha male person on your podcast and you notice this part of you that's like, yeah, it doesn't feel as safe fully kind of opening up and engaging, it's because the alpha male, there's more of a somebody in there, right? There's more square footage that he's taking up inside of him where there's not as much space for him to bring someone else into him. It's very much, if you think about like, you know, the male and the female has the vagina, which is the empty cavity that receives the male. Right? So the female is the emptiness and the male is the one that fills the empty space. Right? So when I'm in my feminine, I'm emptying myself and becoming essentially a hollow container to be filled with someone else that I can make room for. But the alpha male doesn't have the space inside of them yet for that receiving act to happen.
From your perspective then, I know we're talking about someone who's dead, and I love Ram Dass. Do you think that the fundamental work of Ram Dass was teaching the feminine polarity then?
On some level, yes. But, you know, what he was really teaching is the letting go of the models of where you create identity from. You know, like the masculine is like, this is me. You know, I'm a lawyer, I'm an attorney, I'm a teacher, I'm a father, I'm this, I'm that. And it's like, yeah, that's like what Ram Dass calls like your somebodyness, like your attachment to this idea of who you think you are. But if you changed your career, you would still be you. If you changed all of these ways in which you identified yourself as, you're still you. So that you are behind all of those roles or archetypes is like what Ram Dass calls like nobody training, which is just more of like an awareness, more of an emptiness. And, you know, the work is really to get back to that part of you that is empty, that is just more awareness than attached to some role or identity that you're playing in society. You know, like something that I think creates a lot of stress for people is, you know, when they attach their sense of self to something outside of them. Like, for example, people will say, I'm a Republican.
Yeah.
It's like, well, now you have to defend your sense of identity against anything that's non-Republican.
We know how that goes.
I'm Jewish. Now you have to defend your sense of self against all other religions. Or I'm a vegan. Now you derive your sense of self based on your dietary choices. So anyone that's a carnivore is a threat to your sense of self.
Spiritual. I fall into that. I defend myself against atheists. Yeah, because I consider myself spiritual. Go on.
Right. So, you know, what I invite people to say instead of I'm Jewish is I practice Judaism. You know, or instead of saying I'm a vegan, say I eat a vegan diet. So now you're creating some space between yourself and the vehicle or the practice you use to navigate life. And just that little bit of space is really important, because just like people pleasing and approval seeking is a way that we give energy and power away, righteousness and defensiveness is another area that we give energy and power away. You know, so a lot of the healing process is reclaiming the energy and the power that we've given away by trying to hold on to some version of ourselves that is really an illusion. You know,
Mm.
I'm a vegan. That's an illusion. Like, that's not who you are. Like, if you ate a steak, you'd still be you.
Yeah.
You know, I'm a Christian. Well, if you became a Buddhist, you'd still be you. Just the vehicle that you're using or the practice that you're applying might be different. So,
Mm.
you know, it's really all conflict in the world is really a crisis of who we think we are.
Yeah.
That's where Ram Dass's teachings really come from.
Mm. Yeah. It seems so simple when you say it like that, and it's like it comes across so simple, but like it's so
We're so attached to those identities.
yeah. It's like it's so simple to say we're attached to our identity, but you know, like again, it's one of these things. Like, is it simple to drop all of your identities? Technically, yes. It's just a choice. Like in 1 second, you could just drop everything. But it's like then at the other end of things, like there's a momentum to the energy. Like it's like the energy of the universe has a momentum, and the energy of your consciousness has a momentum in some sense. And maybe it doesn't. Maybe that idea is just a crutch for holding on to an identity longer than you need to. Wow, and I guess it's just a practice. Like every day, just you know, in a prayer or a meditation, just say like, I am I everything you just said. Like I don't have I am nothing, but not from a place of unworthiness, but more from a place of or like I can be anything.
Mhm.
I can be everything. I can be anything. Um, that's something
Well,
I'm
this is
gonna.
also, go ahead, sorry.
I was just gonna say this is something I'm going to practice in my own life because you know I'm a dreamer. I love entertainment. I love escapism. I don't even want to call it escapism because it makes it seem like you are trying to escape something. I love creativity. I love, you know, I've been getting into these ideas of Lucifer, Ahriman, and Christ. I just listened to the Charvin Jafaria podcast with Paul CHEK when they talk about it. And I found it fascinating that Lucifer isn't a negative energy, it's a tool, it's an archetypal
Mhm.
energy, and it can be used in the positive or the negative. And like the Luciferian, like we all have the Luciferian archetypal energy, or at least if I understand Paul correctly and my own experience with it, it would make sense that we all have the Luciferian energy within us. We all have an Ahrimanic energy within us, because the Luciferian energy within me is my dreaming nature, is my
Mhm.
creativity, is the artist, is the musician, is the that's Lucifer. Like Lucifer is the dreamer. Lucifer is the illusion, and everything outside of the present moment and the physical nature of reality in the moment is, I guess, in some sense, Luciferian. Christ is the consciousness behind the illusion,
Mhm.
and then Ahriman is the materialism in front, like in front of the consciousness, in some
Mhm.
sense. And so, like, and where I'm getting at with this is like with this Luciferian part, like from that standpoint, I'm very Luciferian. You know, from that way of looking at it archetypally, I'm very Luciferian. I love dreaming. I love creativity. I love art. I love music. I love all of these things that don't exist yet, and I love bringing them into the world. In some sense,
Mhm.
that would be the Luciferian in the positive, right?
Mhm.
And part of that is I love role playing. I love being a cowboy. I love being myself or who I think I am. Like I love this person that has, you know, that I've kind of clinged on to as me. And everything you just said is like, you know, even when I moved to Mexico, it'd be cool to have like a blank slate and just be like, who do I want to act as in this country, and even beyond that, kind of what I'm getting from you is not even who do I want to replace my identity. How about choose it? Like you have the freedom to choose who you want to be in any moment. Do you want to be like a cowboy one moment, like a gangster the next, or at least just in that energy signature? So I found that very cool that you just shared that.
Yeah, one of my teachers recently once asked me this question: where are you rebelling against your true nature?
What is my true nature?
And for me, I reclaim my true nature by going back to my childhood. And
Mm,
I remember, like I shared when we started the podcast, being that child who's very quiet, who is very silent and didn't really say a whole lot. And for our culture, that could be very uncomfortable to be around.
yeah.
So I remember, number one, like being bullied and made fun of by like kids in school, even like parents. And I remember like always being in the car with either my parent or someone else that was driving me. And I was just like looking out the window, like not saying anything and just like really, really quiet. And the question would always be, Greg, what's wrong? So after hearing this question over and over again, Greg, what's wrong? Greg, what's wrong? Greg, what's wrong? I started to develop this belief system that my true nature or my natural state of being is wrong, which was just quiet, silent, observant, just present. And so I tried to become other than that. I tried many different personas, but, like Alan Watts talks about, the word persona means mask. Right. So personality coming from the word persona means the masks that we wear.
Wow. Personality. Persona.
Yeah. So I tried many different masks to see what would fit and what would allow me to feel a sense of belonging, connection, to fit in. And eventually, that kept me safe for a period of time. That brought me a level of safety of like, okay, I'm going to wear this mask. It's not really who I am, but I feel acknowledged, I feel seen, I feel heard, and I feel a sense of belonging. So it feels safe. But eventually we get to this point, and this is usually where we hit a health or healing crisis, which is the pattern that once kept you safe eventually holds you back from being free. And
Yeah.
if we hold on to the model of safety at the expense of our freedom, it creates more and more pain in our life. It might be anxiety, it might be depression, it might be a physical illness, till eventually we let go of that old model of safety and what kept us secure and alive for however long it did. And we really give ourselves full permission to experience freedom, which for me is right now giving myself full permission to return back to that natural state. Like, can I sit at the dinner table and be present with my partner or my family and not have to say anything, not actually have to use words, not actually have to express anything, but just can I just be there and know that just being there and being present is enough? And what I came to realize is anyone who asked me what's wrong or anyone that had a hard time with my silent nature, I was really witnessing an ego in its unraveling process. And the ego has a really hard time with silence. That's why a lot of people have a hard time with meditation, is because in silence, the ego doesn't have anything to attach to. And also silence is a deeper state of intimacy. Words are usually what we use to avoid intimacy. This is why, when two shamans meet for the first time, they'll sit together for hours, but no one will say a word.
Really?
Yeah. It might be, I've talked to shamans who have had meetings with other healers and they've sat together for 4 to 6 hours and never said anything. And then they get up and leave, and that was their whole, But a lot happens there, but it just wasn't telepathically, energetically, just an acknowledgement, an acknowledgement of each other's presence, an acknowledgement of each other's being. And words didn't have to be used to fill the space with anything more than that. Right. So it's more of an acknowledgement of the soul than a connection of two egos coming together. Right. So realizing that I was in the presence of more egos unraveling because my silence was really a space that their ego had nothing to engage with. It was kind of like their ego was saying like, what the fuck is wrong with you? But their soul was saying, thank you. Right? Thank you for acknowledging the truth of me. Well, my ego is judging you for being so quiet and so socially awkward and etc. You know, so that's something that for me, I see how much I've rebelled against my true nature or abandoned myself by trying to put on various masks. And, you know, my work right now is to really give myself full permission to return back to my original nature. You know, I think that's what all of us are actually longing for. And sometimes even that's what loneliness really is. Loneliness is not the absence of someone else. It's the disconnection from our original nature.
So we have 10 more minutes till 1:30 my time. I know you have a appointment. There's a couple things I wanted to ask.
Sure.
Because it's interesting. So from what you just shared, what I got from that is we have a true nature. Because, you know, right before that, what I was kind of on a journey with thinking in the moment was this idea that maybe we don't have a nature and maybe in any moment we get to choose who we are. And who knows, maybe these are not mutually exclusive. And then you said, from what I gathered, our true nature is kind of who we are at birth. Now that would be more in line with numerology, astrology, and anything that says we have a base kind of archetype. So first of all, I find that interesting. That was always kind of my understanding of things. Because, and here's a quick question. Just, you don't have to go into it too much. Do you think who you are on this podcast in this moment is your true nature?
Yes and no. I would say yes, in the sense that my presence is here, right? I'm listening, I'm witnessing, I'm observing, and I'm also playing a role, right? You're playing a role as the podcaster, I'm playing a role as the guest.
Yeah.
So is my true nature a guest and is your true nature a podcaster? No, because we could totally flip-flop. And let's say I had a podcast, which I don't, you could be the guest and now I'm the podcaster. Yeah. So those are still masks that we're wearing that we could trade any given time. But behind that, there is an original nature that is always present. So it's kind of like yes and no. We have the original nature, and then we also play the game of life, which takes us into different roles that we get to choose at any given moment.
And then another question I was thinking is, like when I was a kid, like from what my mom tells me, very curious, quite energetic. I like to move a lot. Very curious. I'd ask a million questions. I've always been a question asker. I've always loved to share. That, like, as much as I'm curious about the universe and the world, I equally love to share my own passion, because I'm an incredibly passionate person. Just like I love sharing. I love both. I love, again, why I like I'm very, I'm not Aubrey Marcus, but it's like him and Joe Rogan are kind of what I modeled my podcast after, as they were some of the first people, it seemed like, on the market that were more conversationalists rather than interviewers. And I was like, that's me. I was like, that was just like me. And in some sense, when you were talking about that, I was thinking, I'm like, who I am right now in this conversation, am I molding my behavior off of you? Because in some sense, I'm very calm right now. I'm in my thoughtful, philosophical nature, which also at the same time is one of my fundamental natures too, because the philosopher is one of my fundamental archetypes. Mm-hmm. I'm a really weird balance of archetypes in that I'm equally as philosophical as I am passionate. Mm-hmm. And it kind of puts me in these two directions, but they are really conjoined. And I was curious, like, if we really were fully ourselves in a podcast, like you and I was like, would that even work? Because if you were very quiet and just observant, like, wouldn't I be talking the entire time? Like, because again, I would be the passionate, curious, sharing guy who would talk energetically a lot and then ask you a question. Like it is in my nature. I want the other person to come forward. Like, I don't necessarily know if I want them to come forward. I want to connect. That was also always part of my nature, connection. As much as I have this forward energy projection, like not projection like a mask, but my energy is like, it can be strong. I think I even apologized to you when I met you because I thought maybe I was too much. And I was like, when you were speaking about all that, I was like, am I in my true nature right now in this podcast? And I think I half am. I think I have minimized in my conversations with you specifically because you're so calm. I think I minimize my passionate nature. I think I kind of annex that a bit and then leave the equal part of my nature that is real, but all that's left is the quiet, introspective philosopher that seeks connection. You know what I mean?
Are you afraid I couldn't handle it?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm afraid. I'm afraid I'll push you away. Yeah. I'm afraid you'll be like, it's almost, I think what I was getting at before when I shared with you as well is that about the opening self up. Like, I feel like I like you a lot, but I'm also scared of my friendship with you because it almost feels too vulnerable. And something that will climb in my mind is it like, are our personalities compatible? If we did become true friends, like, is he too quiet for me and am I too expressive for him? And it hurts me and it almost makes me tear up a bit because how, like, I really love you. And it's like, it's almost like loving somebody and like thinking, and maybe it's just the fearful part of you is like at the same time fearing, is this destined to fail because we are just incompatible, even though I have this love for this person. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And, I've had those dynamics in relationships before where I might be in a relationship with someone that's like super expressive and always sharing. And I've been someone who's always like processed things more internally.
Yeah.
And has kind of like been the space to receive, but not necessarily the one that's really like sharing as much. And, my partner recently just shared with me just like how vulnerable that can be for her. Yeah. Because sometimes it might feel like, what if he has like this whole private life that I don't even know about, or like, what if, there's so much to him that I don't know that he just doesn't share, so, part of my work within myself is to explore like, well, what are my fears around sharing? My fears are probably the same as your fears, which are that we're going to be too much for one another.
Yeah.
So you realize that where you're coming from and where I'm coming from is exactly the same wound, which is the fear of being too much. And if I'm too much, what if I get abandoned?
Yeah.
So there's kind of like the hesitation of like oversharing. I might go to one extreme and so forth. So yeah, I definitely could see that. And, one of the reasons I really appreciate you sharing that is because it's an opportunity for me to look at you know, there's a light side for me being the person that people feel safe around to share, and to be the quiet, silent presence. But there's also the shadow side, which is, am I really afraid of bringing my full self to the table? You know, so that's something that I have to work with within myself. And also I think the question of like, am I being my original nature, my authentic self or not? One of the ways we can answer that is we can assess in any given situation the version of us that we're being. Does it feel stressful or draining in any way? If it feels stressful or draining of our energy, like it depletes us, that's usually us not being our authentic self. Usually when we're in our authenticity, it feels energizing and it feels calm. You know, so I know for me, like the times that I've had social anxiety or felt depleted after an engagement with someone or felt overwhelmed in some way, it's because I was being other than my natural self. You know, I was trying to adopt a version of me that I thought would fit that situation, but it wasn't my true nature. So I think if it shifts us into a stress response or it depletes our energy, it's usually a easy sign for us that it means we kind of stepped out of alignment with that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I definitely did that in this conversation. That yeah, because I can feel a slight drain. I almost feel like in my body, fear. I feel fear. I feel, because it feels like the distance between your nature and my nature is so great. Yeah, I'm just like, I'm just like, yeah, fear of judgment. If I was to really let all of me out, because like I said, yeah, I have a lot of energy, and a lot of like power, and I've been shamed in that a lot. I've been shamed a lot in my like I got expelled twice. I got suspended like 26 times growing up when I was a kid. So like I was like kicked out of schools and suspended because I was literally too much. That's what they literally said. Too much. So it's like, yeah, I have that like, yeah, that fear of
But, you know, that's the same fear that I have, which brings me to the other polarity.
So you feel like you also have a lot that you want to bring forward, but you're afraid of the judgment, so you pull back in your base nature. Because I'm also pulling back, but my base nature is really strong. So it seems like my base nature is strong and I'm pulling back. And you've stated your base nature is calm and observant, but you're also pulling, like, how does that work in the relationship?
Well, I'm actually kind of stepping in more.
Oh, yeah, okay, I hear you.
Right. So there's almost a balancing act of my nature might be more reserved and I'm stepping in, and your nature might be more kind of stepping in and you're kind of pulling back. And, you know, for example, like when you asked me the initial question of tell us your story, you know, my body went into a huge stress response, you know, like increased heart rate, like all of that. So that was me feeling seen, feeling heard, which for the invisible child archetype is very uncomfortable. The invisible child archetype is the one who feels much more comfortable not being seen and not being heard. Right? Because if I'm not seen and not heard, I can't be attacked or judged, etc. right? So telling your story is actually me stepping into myself as an individual, you know, and being an individual can be quite vulnerable. You know, if you want to get a little woo-woo for a sec, being one with the universe can be a hiding spot.
Yeah.
Because if you're one with the universe, you're never an individual that someone else is in relationship with, which means you can get judged, you can get rejected, you can get abandoned, you can get attacked. So the shadow side of becoming nobody is the fear of being somebody. You know, this is why Ram Dass says you have to be somebody first before you become nobody.
Oh.
You know, this is why, like Paul Czech says about psychedelics, you have to form a mind before you blow a mind.
Whoa.
Because
yeah.
if you blow a mind before you form a mind, or you become nobody before you become somebody, you lose connection to home base. Right? You lose connection to your identity as an individual self. Which is why, like we were talking earlier about that superior and inferior ego.
Yeah.
You know, like my invisible child, my nobodiness is very comfortable for me, but my work here as a soul is to develop more of an ego structure so I can come to know myself differentiated from other. Where the superior ego is the one who's like all about themselves, where they need to learn their interconnectedness of like, hey, yeah, you're an individual self, but you're also part of a greater whole. So the universe tries to annihilate that ego so it can come to know itself as part of a greater whole. But the inferior empathic person, inferior ego, I don't mean like less than, they already know themselves as interconnected because they can feel it. But they don't really yet know themselves as an individual self, which is why most of the codependency patterns come from empaths, sensitive beings who feel other people's emotions and feel other people's energy and just have a hard time differentiating self from other. You know, this is why Matt Kahn talks about this teaching of like, the empath is here to build an ego, and the narcissistic person is here to dissolve their ego. Right?
Yeah, that's interesting. Again, there's a lot. The last thing I'll say, because we only have 10 more minutes till your appointment. Yeah, my life path is a weird one, man. Because I think my base nature is high ego, and then I was like shattered down to nothing, and then now I'm rebuilt. Like it's like I'm just trying to get back to zero in some sense. Because I'm very like. Also, what is weird about me is, again, I'm a passionate person with a lot of energy, but I'm also highly empathic and highly sensitive. So I'm like on that duality spectrum, I don't really belong anywhere. I'm as sensitive as the sensitive kid, and I seem to have came into the world with a big ego.
Well, it really comes down to the balance of power and humility. Right? So the empath on one end of the spectrum is all humility, no power. And then the narcissist, for example, is all power but lacking humility. So for you, it's a balancing act of empowered humility, of can I be in my power but also be humble? You know, you could say one side of the spectrum is the empath who's always throwing themselves under the bus. And the other side is, you know, the politician who feels as though they're God and the center of the universe and lacks all humility. You know, where can we merge the two and find a nice balance of empowered humility? I think that's where we're all trying to get to. which
Amen.
is not superior or inferior ego. It's kind of the, like you said, the 0 point.
Hmm. All right. So now going into plug time. So if you can please share with myself and everybody where we can find you, what you're currently working on, and if people want to support you, how they can support you.
Yeah, so my home base is my website, healing4d.com. So that's where they can, see all of my offerings. I have my online program, which is Healing the Mind, A Journey to Wholeness, which is a 21-day online program. It's a fully holistic approach to mental health. Um, One of the things that I'm doing a lot of work now is around archetypes.
Mm.
So around this time of year, I'm supporting a lot of people in casting their archetype wheel so they can kind of work with that in the new year. So on my website, they can see some information on that as well. And then the last thing is actually just on January 1st, my partner and I just launched an online community, a membership-based healing community, which is synergymedicine.us, where we do like weekly group coaching calls, live streams, put out content and courses and things like that. So one of the big things this year is kind of creating a sense of community with people with shared values on, healing journey. So synergymedicine.us is the community platform for people to check out. So social media, Instagram is 4D Healing. And I have a YouTube channel. It's just my name, Greg Schmaus, and I post some teaching videos on there as well. I'm not as active on YouTube as I am on Instagram. So those would be the best places to find me in this universe.
Thanks, man. And yeah, these podcasts are always vulnerable, like, intense for me in a non-intensive way. Like, it's just,
Yeah.
yeah, it's intense for me. There's a lot to process, and I find every time I talk with you, which has been 2 times, well, even like, after and before, like, at the end, for anyone that doesn't know, like, me and you talked for, I think, like 20 minutes after the last podcast and got pretty vulnerable there. But yeah, man, I just find you like an excellent mirror. Like, I find you so wise. Like, you're really wise. You're very self-reflective, and you look at things in a way that most people don't. And I was just so impressed by you when I first came across you with Paul Czech. I remember I showed my mom that podcast. She loves you too. And like, I was like, Mom,
On
I
which
gotta
one?
check it. You with Paul Czech.
Oh, okay. Okay. Uh-huh.
Yeah, like 2 years ago or something. And yeah, I sent my mom
Uh-huh.
that one, and I was like, you gotta check this guy out. He's awesome. Like, this podcast is great. And
Uh-huh.
yeah, it's cool to like have you on my podcast after being a fan of you and Paul's before, man. But yeah, you're a very special person, and I very value your insights and just, yeah, man, that space you give can be very confronting, especially for someone like myself
Mm.
who has a fast mind. Um, but it's like, yeah, just, yeah, how you hold space and the wisdom you have, man. I'm very grateful to have you on the podcast, so thanks.
Yeah, and I appreciate the space that you hold on your show and just for giving me the opportunity to be a part of it. And I'll also acknowledge that, podcasting is a vulnerable thing for me as well because of what it brings up inside of me, given, everything that I've shared, in this show about, my nature growing up. So, when I was asked certain questions, like the first question of like, tell me your story, and I noticed that fear and stress response, it was a podcast that I felt totally safe. And it was a person, yourself, that I felt totally safe holding space for myself while that stuff was coming up, where there's other podcasters that might be interviewing me that I might feel like I have to perform at a certain level or I can't be that vulnerable. So there's a part of me that wants to like compartmentalize those emotions and those fears and those vulnerabilities. But I never felt like I had to do that on your show. So that's a testament to also the space that you hold for your guests, myself being the guest today. So I appreciate that.
Thanks, brother. I love you, dude, and take care, okay?
You got it, man. Love you too, brother. Be well.
Welcome back, everyone. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to let me know in the comment section down below. And if you want to check out more episodes just like this one, click right here, and I'll see you in the next one.